I'll never forget the day Margaret Chen walked into my office with trembling hands, holding a crumpled piece of paper that would expose one of the most calculating inheritance thefts I've ever seen in my 20 years as an estate attorney. Her mother had just signed away $8 million to her caregiver, and Margaret knew something was terribly wrong because her mother couldn't even remember doing it. Let me take you back to how this whole nightmare started. Margaret's mother, Dorothy Chen, was a 78-year-old widow who had built a small real estate empire in California over 4 decades. She was sharp as a tack, managed her own properties until she was 75, and had always been crystal clear about her estate plan. Everything was supposed to go to Margaret and her brother Stephen, split 50-50. Dorothy had told them this 100 times, had it written in her will, and never wavered from that decision. Then Dorothy had a fall. Nothing too serious, just slipped on some water in her kitchen and fractured her hip. She needed surgery, and afterwards, she needed help at home during recovery. That's when Linda Morrison entered their lives. Linda was a professional caregiver, came with glowing references, seemed perfect for the job. She was in her late 40s, warm, attentive, and Dorothy seemed to like her right away. Margaret thought they'd found a blessing in disguise. The first few months were fine. Linda helped Dorothy with physical therapy, cooked her meals, kept the house clean, and Dorothy was recovering well. Margaret visited 3 times a week, and everything seemed normal. But then Margaret started noticing small changes. Her mother seemed more tired than usual, sometimes confused about what day it was, and increasingly, Dorothy would forget conversations they'd just had. Margaret mentioned it to Dorothy's doctor, who ran some tests but found nothing alarming. He said it could just be the stress of recovery and aging. Then one afternoon, Margaret got a call from her mother's bank. They were concerned about a large withdrawal Dorothy had made, $80,000 in cash. When Margaret confronted her mother about it, Dorothy seemed genuinely confused. She didn't remember withdrawing any money. Margaret's alarm bells went off. She checked her mother's accounts and found several other unusual transactions over the past 3 months, all in amounts just under the threshold that would trigger automatic bank reviews. That's when Margaret decided to investigate Linda Morrison. She hired a private investigator, and what they found made her blood run cold. Linda had worked for 4 other elderly clients before Dorothy. 3 of them had died, and in each case, Linda had received substantial gifts of money or property shortly before their deaths. One case had gone to court, but there wasn't enough evidence to prove wrongdoing, and Linda walked away with a settlement. Armed with this information, Margaret confronted Linda at her mother's house. Linda denied everything, said the gifts were freely given, that the elderly people she cared for loved her and wanted to take care of her because she took such good care of them. She was calm, almost rehearsed in her responses. That's when Margaret knew she was dealing with a professional con artist. 2 weeks later, Margaret received the document that brought her to my office. It was a new will, signed by Dorothy just 3 days earlier, leaving her entire $8 million estate to Linda Morrison. Margaret and Stephen were completely cut out. The signature was Dorothy's, it was notarized, and it appeared completely legal. But when Margaret asked her mother about it, Dorothy had no memory of signing anything. In fact, Dorothy was horrified, insisting she would never do such a thing. I knew immediately we were dealing with something sinister. I've seen elder abuse cases before, but this one had all the hallmarks of something more calculated. I told Margaret we needed to act fast. First, we needed to get Dorothy to a doctor for a complete toxicology screening. Second, we needed to secure all of Dorothy's financial accounts. Third, we needed to file for an emergency restraining order to keep Linda away from Dorothy. The toxicology screening came back, and that's when everything clicked into place. Dorothy had high levels of benzodiazepines in her system, specifically lorazepam, a drug that causes confusion, memory loss, and makes people highly suggestible. Dorothy had no prescription for this medication. Someone had been giving it to her without her knowledge. Now I had my smoking gun, but I needed to prove Linda was the one drugging Dorothy. We got a court order to search Linda's belongings at Dorothy's house. In her room, we found a bottle of lorazepam prescribed to a different name, someone who had died 2 years earlier, one of Linda's previous clients. We also found a journal, and this is where Linda made her fatal mistake. She had documented everything. Every dose she gave Dorothy, every confused moment, every time Dorothy was pliable enough to sign something. She had written it all down like she was proud of her system. The journal revealed Linda's entire method. She would start with small doses of the drug, mixing it into morning coffee or evening tea. She'd time it so Dorothy would be most confused during important moments, like when meeting with notaries or bankers. She'd coach Dorothy on what to say, and in her drugged state, Dorothy would comply. Linda had even written about how she planned to use the $8 million, detailing investments she wanted to make, trips she wanted to take, a house she wanted to buy in Florida. But the most damning entry was about the day Dorothy signed the new will. Linda wrote about giving Dorothy double her usual dose that morning, about how Dorothy could barely stay awake during the signing, about how the notary seemed concerned but Linda convinced her that Dorothy was just tired from her medication. Linda even wrote that she made sure to be extra caring that day so Dorothy would feel grateful and compliant. We immediately filed criminal charges against Linda for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. We also filed a civil suit to void the fraudulent will and recover any assets Linda had already taken. The case moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. Linda's own words convicted her. The notary who had witnessed the will signing was called to testify. She admitted she had concerns that day, but Linda assured her everything was fine. She described Dorothy as barely coherent, struggling to hold the pen, and not seeming to understand what she was signing. The notary had made notes about this but had gone through with the notarization anyway, something she deeply regretted. We also brought in a handwriting expert who analyzed Dorothy's signature on the fraudulent will. While it was technically Dorothy's signature, the expert noted the shakiness, the lack of pressure in certain strokes, and other indicators consistent with someone who was significantly impaired when signing. Combined with the toxicology report and Linda's journal entries, we had an airtight case. Dorothy's regular doctor testified about the dramatic change he'd noticed in Dorothy's cognitive function during the time Linda was caring for her. He said Dorothy had gone from being sharp and engaged to confused and forgetful almost overnight. He'd attributed it to depression or early dementia, but now it was clear she'd been systematically drugged. The district attorney's office took the case very seriously. They discovered Linda had done this before, not just with the 3 cases Margaret's investigator had found, but potentially with 7 other elderly clients over a 15-year period. She had moved from state to state, changing her name slightly each time, building trust with vulnerable people and then systematically robbing them. The estimated total of her thefts was over $20 million. During the trial, Linda's defense tried to argue that Dorothy had given the gifts willingly, that the low razepam in her system could have come from anywhere, and that the journal was just creative writing. But our evidence was too strong. We had the drugs found in Linda's possession, we had her detailed journal documenting her crimes, we had medical testimony about Dorothy's impairment, we had the notary's concerns, and most importantly, we had Dorothy herself, now clear-headed and medication-free, testifying that she never wanted to leave her estate to Linda and had no memory of signing the will. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Linda guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. The judge called her crimes particularly heinous because she had targeted the most vulnerable members of society and had shown no remorse. In his sentencing statement, he said Linda had betrayed the sacred trust between caregivers and those they care for. The fraudulent will was voided, and Dorothy's original will was reinstated. We recovered all the money Linda had taken, including the $80,000 in cash and several other unauthorized withdrawals. We also filed claims against Linda's assets, including a condo she had purchased with stolen money, which was sold and the proceeds returned to Dorothy's estate. But the case didn't end there. I worked with law enforcement in 3 other states to help victims of Linda's previous schemes. 2 families were able to recover substantial portions of what Linda had stolen from their deceased relatives. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and it gave them a sense of justice. Dorothy lived for another 6 years after this ordeal. She never fully recovered from the emotional trauma of being betrayed by someone she trusted, but she was grateful to have her daughter's persistence and to have her estate restored. She set up a foundation to help other elder abuse victims and became an advocate for stronger protections for vulnerable adults. She told me once that while she couldn't change what happened to her, she could use her experience to help others. Margaret and Stephen inherited their mother's estate as Dorothy had always intended. They continued their mother's advocacy work and donated significantly to organizations fighting elder abuse. Margaret told me that while the money mattered, what mattered more was knowing they'd stopped Linda from hurting anyone else and that they'd honored their mother's wishes. This case changed how I practice law. I became much more vigilant about signs of elder abuse, and I started training other attorneys on what to look for. The red flags are often subtle. Sudden changes in estate plans, unusual withdrawal patterns, New people inserted into an elderly person's life who quickly gain financial access, cognitive decline that seems to appear suddenly, and isolation from family members. I also learned that evil often comes in the most ordinary packages. Linda Morrison looked like any other caregiver, warm and professional. But she was a predator who had perfected her system over years. She knew exactly how to gain trust, how to isolate her victims, and how to cover her tracks. What she didn't count on was a daughter who refused to accept that something wasn't right and an attorney who was willing to dig deep to find the truth. The most important lesson from this case is that we must protect our elderly loved ones. Visit them regularly, stay involved in their finances, meet their caregivers and ask questions. Trust your instincts when something feels off, and act quickly if you suspect abuse. Dorothy was lucky that Margaret acted when she did. If Margaret had waited even a few more months, Linda might have convinced Dorothy to sell properties or make additional transfers that would have been much harder to recover. I keep a photo on my desk from Dorothy's 80th birthday party, about 2 years after we won the case. She's surrounded by Margaret, Stephen, and her grandchildren, all smiling. Dorothy sent me that photo with a note that said, "Thank you for giving me back my family and my peace of mind." That photo reminds me every day why I became a lawyer and why this work matters. Looking back, the $80 million question wasn't just about the money. It was about dignity, justice, and protecting those who can't protect themselves. Linda Morrison stole more than money from Dorothy. She stole her autonomy, her trust, and nearly stole her legacy. But in the end, justice prevailed, and that's what matters most. This case taught me that sometimes the most important work we do as attorneys isn't about winning the biggest cases or making the most money. It's about standing up for people who need someone in their corner, about being willing to fight even when the odds seem long, and about never accepting that something is right just because it appears legal on paper. Sometimes you have to look deeper, ask harder questions, and trust that the truth will reveal itself if you're persistent enough to find it. And that's exactly what we did for Dorothy Chen. We found the truth, we fought for justice, and we won.